Welcome back to the Piping Pastor, Theology Talks. Today we'll be concluding our discussion of eschatology by getting into the third aspect, which is the Millennial Kingdom. So this evening, I'm enjoying some plum pudding bourbon barrel-aged reserve in my Curtis Mearsham Churchwarden pipe. Definitely have to order some more of this. Definitely one of my favorites. I didn't want to share with you before we get into our discussion today these cufflinks. I don't think I've worn yet before, but they're gold and glass with a black backing, and I found these in a charity shop. Found most of my stuff in charity shops in Scotland, but this lady that makes them. She makes this jewelry from glass and gold leaf and things like that. But she only sells them from her shop on Oban, and she doesn't have an online presence or anything else like that. So, and I'd never heard of her before. And I discovered these cufflinks, and I was like, wow, these are great. I'd like to get, a couple more sets in some different colors. And the person's like, good luck. I just came across these, but if you want them, you have to go to Oban and hope that she's open because, she only makes them there and she doesn't sell online and she doesn't ship. So we happened to take a trip to Oban maybe 2 or 3 months later, and the shop was no longer there. So she was an older lady, and this was kind of like a retirement fun thing for her, I think. So I may have one of the last sets that she ever made. And they're nothing crazy expensive. As I said, it's just basically like some melted glass with some gold leaf in them. But just the fact that they were handmade by this person who doesn't make them anymore, I enjoy that kind of thing, those kind of singular items in my wardrobe. Let's say, materials wise, not very valuable, but just the story, I think, is worth it. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, the 3 areas that I wanted to discuss, prophecy and tribulation, and then the Millennial Kingdom, or the Millennium. The Millennium is this idea that there's this golden paradise that will occur on earth prior to the Last Judgment. Like heaven on earth before the final end of the days. But it may not surprise you to learn that there are 3 different views of this idea. As there are always different views of the other things we've discussed. But this idea of the Millennial Kingdom, the Millennium, comes out of Revelation, and it's specifically in chapter 20, verses 1 to 3, verse 5, and then verse 7. So 1 to 3, it says, I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Threw him into the abyss, and so on and so forth. Revelation 25 says the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. Revelation 27 says when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison. So we have over and over again this image of this 1,000-year period. Now, these scriptures from Revelation kind of draw from Daniel and Isaiah. Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, and Isaiah 24, verses 21 to 22. And of course, I do have my notes with me, so I don't go rabbit trailing it with the classical Hebrew and ancient Greek and so on and so forth. But in Daniel 2:44, it says, in those days the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Kingdom shall be left to the people. It shall break in pieces. These kingdoms will come to an end and shall stand forever. So basically, God sets up a kingdom, destroys the other kingdoms, but the kingdom is there on earth. In Isaiah 24, 21, and 22, in that day the Lord will punish the powers in the heavens above the kings of the earth below. They will be herded together like prisoners, bound in a dungeon, and they will be shut up in prison and punished after many days. So again, this idea of the kingdom being established on earth. Now, this idea that comes out of Isaiah and Daniel is Deutero Isaiah, which is the second half of Isaiah, which was written after the Israelites had been taken away to Babylon in the diaspora. So there's the influence there of Zoroastrianism, and Zoroastrianism is where you get a lot of the duality of spiritual nature. In classical Hebrew, prior to that, there wasn't this stark dichotomy, heaven, hell, and so on and so forth. God was in control of everything. God was everywhere. And there was Sheol, which was the shadowy underworld, but there wasn't this vast difference. And so the idea of heaven to the ancient Israelites was God establishing God's kingdom on earth, essentially. That's why they were a little bit confused when the Messiah came in the form of Jesus Christ and didn't toss the Romans out and establish the kingdom there in Israel in a physical sense. It was much deeper than that, which is a discussion for another time. But that's where those images come from, and that's where that inspiration of Scripture that's written in the New Testament kind of draws from the education of the Old Testament, right? Because Scripture, of course, is inspired of God, but it's written by humans who are influenced in their own education and their own background and their own cultural understanding. So when they receive the revelation of God, it's not as if God, reveals these words to them, verbatim, and they just copy them down like a stenographer, right? So you have to think about the terms of the Old Testament kind of influencing what they're writing and the imagery and things like that they're getting in the inspiration of God. But due to that, we get different views of what the millennium is or what the millennial kingdom is. So we have premillennialist, I'm going to struggle with this one, postmillennialist, and amillennialist. That's going to be a fun one. So the premillennialist, it's based on largely Revelations 20, verses 1 to 10, those verses that I described earlier with the supporting Old Testament scriptures. And with premillennialism, there's actually two groups. You have classic premillennialism and then dispensationalist premillennialism. Theologians like to use big words because it looks nice on paper, but it makes it difficult for us to speak. So give me some grace here. So classic premillennialism, that's the idea that when Jesus comes back, Jesus will establish the kingdom on earth for 1,000 years. It may be symbolic or literal. It could be a literal kingdom, or it could be, a symbolic representation of a kingdom. However, in classic premillennialism, they don't adhere to the idea of a rapture. So there's no rapture before the kingdom, before the millennial kingdom. And we've talked a little bit about the rapture in tribulation. Some people are pre, mid, and post. Some people don't believe in a rapture at all. But in classic premillennialism, there's no rapture there. In dispensational premillennialism, there is a rapture, and the rapture happens, as I think we discussed this in tribulation, prior to tribulation, for most dispensationalists. Some dispensationalists go mid or post. But they hold to the idea that there is indeed a rapture, and then the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, and it is literal. There's no symbolic nature to it. People are raptured, tribulation, establishment of the kingdom, final judgment. And it's like tick, 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 tick. And that's where you get the term dispensationalism, because it's a dispensation of history. And that actually only dates back to about the 19th century. So dispensationalism has not been with us for very long. But again, it is the far more popular view of all the views that we've gone into in the various different ways, largely because, again, popular culture. And as I mentioned in my last video, it preaches well, right? It's easy to do a 3-point sermon on something like that. But the second view we have is post-millennialism. So this is the idea that the millennial kingdom, it occurs before Jesus' second coming rather than after, right? So because Scripture speaks of a time of great prosperity around the world, they see it as like an ongoing golden process, right? So this is something that we're already in, which is, of course, one of the views of tribulation that we spoke about before, that we're already in tribulation and it kind of ramps up towards the end. And this idea, it wasn't really championed by any of the church fathers. This idea that, the premillennial kingdom, the millennial kingdom happens and kind of builds and goes to this crescendo moment when Jesus comes back. That idea was actually popularized by the Puritans. And lost a great deal of favor after World War I and World War II. It's similar in kind to Teilhard de Chardin's Omega Point, the idea that all things come to a culmination and reconciliation with God at the end. So obviously things get back to being better towards the end, essentially. That's kind of like basically the view of postmillennialism. I should just use initials. And that comes from Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2 to 3. That's the scripture that they use to back that up. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest mountain. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many people will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we will walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, and the world from Jerusalem." So, but again, this view after back-to-back world wars and all the carnage and death and everything, everyone was kind of like, okay, I don't think we're heading to some kind of golden point, right? And it lost a lot of favor, but it's still out there, still exists. The last one is the amillennialist. Amillennialism is the idea that the Millennial Kingdom is a symbolic heavenly reality. It's not an earthly reality. It's nothing that's going to happen in the physical realm. According to the amillennialist, Christ is ruling right now. Christ is ruling over his church, and Satan is bound away because people can hear the gospel. People can be preached to. People can understand the message of the gospel. And so Satan already must be bound away. So there's no 1,000-year reign on earth because Christ is already reigning on earth. And as such, there's also no rapture. So within all three of these different views, you've only really got the rapture in half of the first one. It pops up a lot more in the idea of tribulation, probably because people are thinking about, oh, it's tribulation, try to figure out some way out of it. The Millennial Kingdom makes you kind of want to hang around, 1,000 years of golden reign of God on earth, right? But again, there's more than one way to look at it. There's more than one way to understand it. And that's why it's important to study the scriptures for yourself, as deeply as you can. And for me, when I first started studying, before I went back to school and did all that stuff, I just went to the library and got a bunch of books. I got a Greek lexicon, I got a Hebrew lexicon. I realized I didn't understand anything in either one of them. So I got some other commentaries. I talked to some seminary professors who were more than happy to tell me, what sources to look at and where to point myself, for the beginner type stuff. Do this investigation on your own, read it for yourself. It helps to know the original languages because then you can really delve into what these verses really mean. But again, that takes, a lot of language study. But hey, if you got to have a hobby, it's good to have one that educates you. So in any case, that'll be it for this. So we are finished now with our series on eschatology. So now, as I previously promised, I might get into a theological view of aliens. So I can finally get that TARDIS discussion in there for Redcoat's return. So in any case, I'm going to relight and get back to my meerschaum here. I hope you have a lovely week. And as always, happy reading.